The battle unfolding around Araucourt represented Germany's final major armoured thrust in the Lorraine region. General Hasso von Manteuffel had assembled the 5th Panzer Army with impressive strength, 262 tanks and assault guns, including elite units like the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, supplemented by the veteran 11th Panzer Division. This formidable force fielded 107 Panthers, 75 Panzer Mark IVs, and 80 assault guns, all aimed at halting General George Patton's relentless advance toward the German frontier. Among the attacking formations, the 113th Panzer Brigade represented both the promise and problems of late-war German armour. Though hastily assembled and still working through training deficiencies, these units operated some of the most technologically advanced tanks Germany had yet produced. The Panthers rolling forward that morning mounted high-velocity 75mm guns capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. Their frontal armour, ingeniously sloped at 55 degrees and 80mm thick, could deflect virtually every anti-tank weapon the Americans possessed. But German engineering, for all its sophistication, had created a critical vulnerability that would prove fatal. The designers had concentrated their armour protection against ground-level threats, giving the roof plating only 16 to 25mm of thickness on Panthers and 25mm on Tigers. The concept that their greatest danger might come from above, and particularly from something as seemingly harmless as an observation aircraft armed with infantry weapons, had never seriously entered their calculations. Throughout the war, German tactical doctrine regarding small observation aircraft had remained remarkably consistent. Aircraft like the L-4 Grasshopper were classified as reconnaissance platforms, essentially harmless spotters that were best ignored. Shooting at them served only to reveal German positions and invite devastating artillery strikes. This tactical calculus was about to be violently overturned. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commanding the 58th Panzer Corps, would later assess these newly formed panzer brigades as possessing only slight combat value, hampered by incomplete training and inadequate equipment. These units lacked proper reconnaissance capabilities, forcing them to advance essentially blind against well-prepared American defenses. They were about to encounter something their training manuals had never addressed and their commanders had never imagined. The man orchestrating this unexpected threat had come from the most unlikely background. Charles Marston Carpenter entered the world on August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois, born into a farming family that would lose everything when the Great Depression devastated American agriculture. The divorce of his parents added to the hardship, forcing young Charles and his siblings to work neighbouring farms just to survive. Despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, Carpenter excelled academically, earning scholarships that would take him to Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo, Illinois, and then to Centre College in Danville, Kentucky. Before the war transformed everything, Carpenter had found his calling as a history teacher at Moline High School. There he met Elder Fritschel, whom he married in 1940. They welcomed a daughter, Carol, into a world that was already sliding toward global conflict. When America finally entered the war in 1942, the 30-year-old teacher made the decision to enlist rather than wait to be drafted. He received his commission as a second lieutenant and completed flight training, demonstrating an aptitude for aviation that would prove crucial. By 1944, now promoted to major, Carpenter found himself assigned to the 1st Bombardment Division in France before being transferred to fly artillery support missions for General George Patton's legendary 4th Armoured Division. His primary duty involved reconnaissance and artillery spotting missions in an L-4H Grasshopper, which was simply the military designation for what had been the civilian Piper J-3 Cub. What made his position unusual was his additional role as personal pilot for General John Wood, commander of the 4th Armoured Division. This relationship gave Carpenter an extraordinary degree of freedom to pursue his own tactical initiatives, freedom that most junior officers could never have expected. The aircraft assigned to him, bearing the serial number 43-30426, would soon earn a name that played on the famous wartime icon of female industrial workers. They called her Rosie the Rocketer. In August of 1944, Carpenter wrote a letter home to Elder that hinted at the dangerous game he was playing. He admitted to taking quite a few chances lately, though he credited his marvelous luck with keeping him alive. Just the previous day, he'd taken a bullet hole through his wing and struck a church steeple with one wheel, though he considered himself fortunate that nothing worse had happened under the circumstances. His philosophy of warfare, shared with Associated Press correspondent Wes Gallagher, was elegantly simple and brutally direct. Attack, attack, and then attack again. That was the only way Carpenter believed wars could be won. The concept of arming an L4 hadn't originated entirely with Carpenter. Earlier in the campaign, Lieutenants Harley Merrick and Roy Carson had experimented with mounting bazookas on their observation planes, successfully destroying 2 German trucks in the process. But Carpenter would take this experimental concept and refine it into a devastatingly effective system, pushing it to levels of success that no one had imagined possible. The modification process began modestly with 2 M1A1 bazookas attached to the wing struts. Working closely with ordnance technicians, Carpenter developed a mounting system that used plywood backing plates to distribute the weight and recoil forces across the wing structure, which had never been designed to handle such loads. Electrical wiring snaked from the launch tubes into the cockpit, terminating at toggle switches that allowed him to fire the rockets individually or in coordinated salvos. Initial testing revealed significant problems that needed immediate attention. The M1A1 bazookas, firing 2.36-inch diameter rockets, could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor, which was sufficient for light vehicles and trucks, but marginal at best against proper tank armor. Carpenter upgraded to 6 M9 bazookas, which fired the improved M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rockets. These more powerful weapons could penetrate 3.9 inches of armor at a 30-degree impact angle, which was just enough to defeat the thin top armor of any German tank in the field, including the mighty Tigers. The complete modification added approximately 106 pounds to an aircraft already operating at the absolute limit of its weight capacity. With a gross weight limit of 1,220 pounds, and the pilot, fuel, and basic equipment already consuming most of that capacity, Carpenter had to make a crucial sacrifice. He would fly alone. The observer's position, normally occupied on reconnaissance missions, remained empty on his combat sorties. There simply wasn't enough lift capacity to carry another person and the weapons simultaneously. The aerodynamic impact of mounting 6 bazooka tubes on an aircraft designed for gentle cruising flight was substantial. The rockets created considerable drag, reducing the already modest top speed and making the aircraft even more sluggish in turns. The Piper Cub that had been engineered for peaceful observation missions over friendly territory now carried the anti-tank firepower of half a dozen infantry teams. The technical challenge of actually hitting a tank from the air in an L4 seemed almost insurmountable when examined objectively. The aircraft had no gun sight, no sophisticated aiming system, nothing beyond the pilot's own eye and judgment. The bazookas were fixed in position, pointing straight ahead, which meant Carpenter had to aim the entire aircraft at his target like a fighter pilot engaging in a gun run. The M6A3 rockets had an effective range of approximately 300 yards under ideal conditions, but accuracy decreased dramatically beyond 100 yards. To achieve a killing hit, Carpenter developed a specific attack profile that would become his unmistakable signature. Starting from an altitude of roughly 1,500 feet, he would identify his target and begin a corkscrew descent designed to confuse anti-aircraft gunners on the ground. This spiral approach made it extremely difficult for German forces to predict his flight path and establish an effective lead for their weapons. At approximately 300 feet, he would level out briefly to stabilize his approach, align his aircraft precisely with the target, then push forward into a steep dive. The final approach phase required nerves of absolute steel. At 100 yards distance, barely 300 feet from his target, Carpenter would toggle his firing switches, sending rockets streaking downward toward the vulnerable top armor of German tanks. Immediately after firing, he would pull up sharply, using every bit of the L-4's limited power to climb away from the inevitable storm of return fire. The entire attack sequence, from initiating the dive to climbing back to relative safety, consumed less than 30 seconds. But those were 30 seconds of maximum vulnerability to every weapon the Germans could bring to bear. The Continental A65 engine, never designed for combat operations, struggled mightily with the additional weight and drag of the rocket installation. The aircraft's normal climb rate of 450 feet per minute dropped to barely 200 feet per minute when fully loaded with all 6 rockets. Every foot of altitude was precious. Each additional foot meant another second away from effective small arms range, another moment to plan the next attack run or assess damage to his aircraft. That morning of September 20th, 1944, began with thick fog that kept most aircraft grounded across the region. Combat Command A, operating under the leadership of Colonel Bruce Clark, was holding defensive positions near Aracourt when intelligence reports indicated German armor was massing for a major attack. Carpenter took off despite the marginal weather conditions, trusting that visibility would improve as the morning progressed. When the fog finally lifted around midday, Carpenter was already airborne, methodically searching for targets of opportunity. Below his circling aircraft, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade were advancing, a company of Panther tanks moving in standard formation across open ground toward American positions. The German crews, thoroughly trained to watch for enemy tanks and anti-tank guns at ground level, never considered the small observation plane circling high above as any kind of threat. Carpenter began his attack run, entering the characteristic corkscrew descent that would become infamous among German tank crews. The dive was steep enough to build dangerous speed in the light aircraft, the airframe shuddering with the strain. At precisely 100 yards range, he fired his rockets, 6 projectiles streaking toward the lead Panther. One rocket struck the thin roof armor and penetrated into the crew compartment. The massive tank lurched to a stop, smoke immediately pouring from its hatches as the interior caught fire. Banking hard left, Carpenter climbed away desperately as machine gun fire erupted from the German column below. He could hear the distinctive sound of bullets punching through the fabric skin of his aircraft as he struggled for precious altitude. Within 30 minutes, he had landed at a forward airstrip, supervised the reloading of his rocket tubes, and was airborne again. The second sortie found the German tanks attempting to reorganize after the shock of the first attack. They had spread out their formation, making themselves more difficult targets, but also disrupting their own advance and coordination. Carpenter selected another Panther and dove again. This time the Germans were ready and waiting. Small arms fire filled the air around his fragile aircraft in a deadly curtain. The sound of bullets tearing through fabric accompanied him throughout the entire dive, but his aim remained true despite the terror and distraction. Another Panther was knocked out, its turret crew killed instantly by the blast that penetrated the 16mm roof armor. On his third sortie that afternoon, Carpenter found the surviving tanks beginning to reverse, their entire advance completely disrupted and broken. By the end of the day, he had fired 16 rockets total across 3 combat sorties. 2 Panther tanks were confirmed destroyed by ground forces who inspected the wrecks. The German advance had been halted, and the legend of Bazooka Charlie was born in the telling and retelling among American troops. The 4th Armoured Division's official history would specifically note his role in stopping what could have been a breakthrough German counterattack. Before Carpenter's unprecedented attacks, German military doctrine had treated observation aircraft as minor annoyances at worst. Standard operating procedure was to ignore them unless they presented an immediate and obvious threat. Engaging observation planes would reveal positions to Allied artillery observers and invite devastating fire missions, a poor tactical trade by any calculation. This comfortable assumption changed completely and suddenly after word spread throughout German units about the rocket-armed American observation planes. Wehrmacht units began receiving urgent operational bulletins warning them specifically about American observation aircraft carrying anti-tank weapons. What had been harmless spotters were now potential tank killers requiring immediate and aggressive engagement. Carpenter himself noticed the dramatic change in German behavior almost immediately. As he told a reporter from Stars and Stripes every time he showed up now, German forces shot at him with absolutely everything they had available. They never used to bother with Cubs at all. Those bazookas must be bothering them quite a bit, he concluded with characteristic understatement. The impact on German operations extended far beyond the handful of tanks Carpenter actually destroyed. Tank commanders now had to constantly monitor the skies for slow-moving aircraft, dividing their attention between ground and air threats. Formations had to spread out and disperse whenever L-4s appeared overhead, disrupting their momentum and coordination at critical moments. Anti-aircraft weapons that had been positioned to defend against American fighter bombers had to be redirected toward engaging observation planes flying at much lower altitudes and slower speeds. Infantry units received orders to engage any L-4 with rifles and machine pistols, creating a curtain of fire designed to make low-altitude operations increasingly hazardous for American spotter planes. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered the Battle of Arcourt with 90 operational tanks, would have only 27 still functioning within a single week. While obviously not all these losses can be attributed directly to Carpenter's attacks, his strikes contributed significantly to the psychological pressure that degraded German combat effectiveness across the entire formation. Tank crews who had felt relatively safe from air attack during poor weather now faced a threat that could appear at any moment, regardless of conditions. By October of 1944, Carpenter's reputation had spread throughout both the American and German armies. His most audacious achievement came when he successfully engaged and destroyed Tiger tanks, the most feared and heavily armoured vehicles in the German arsenal. Each Tiger weighed 57 tons and mounted armour up to 100 millimetres thick on the front hull, virtually impervious to most Allied weapons. But their roof armour remained only 25 millimetres thick, still vulnerable to Carpenter's rockets if he could deliver them accurately. His attack on the Tigers required exceptional courage, even by his already extraordinary standards. These massive tanks were typically surrounded by infantry and protected by dedicated light anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to defend against air attack. Carpenter dove through what witnesses described as a solid curtain of tracer fire, released his rockets at minimum range where accuracy was highest, and pulled up just as explosions erupted behind his aircraft. One Tiger was confirmed destroyed when its ammunition detonated in a spectacular explosion that could be seen for miles. The impact of this success extended far beyond the physical destruction of one tank. German tank crews, already under tremendous stress from overwhelming American material superiority, now faced a threat from a completely unexpected direction that their training had never addressed. They could no longer safely park under trees for concealment, as the L-4s could spot them regardless. They couldn't ignore the sound of small aircraft engines overhead, as any one of them might be armed with deadly rockets. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps as valuable as the actual tank kills. Each mission Carpenter flew pushed the boundaries of both physics and probability in ways that seemed to defy rational explanation. The L-4 Grasshopper had never been designed for any kind of combat operations. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning a single tracer round could turn the entire aircraft into an airborne fireball. The pilot sat surrounded by nothing more protective than steel tubing and fabric, completely exposed to enemy fire from every direction. In his carefully censored letters home, written to avoid worrying his wife Elda, Carpenter hinted obliquely at the dangers he faced daily. After one particularly harrowing mission, he wrote simply that he'd had some excitement that day, and that the plane had acquired a few more holes but still flew acceptably. What he carefully didn't mention was that those holes represented near misses that could easily have severed critical control cables, punctured fuel lines, or struck the pilot himself with fatal results. The ground crews who serviced Rosie the Rocketer began keeping informal tallies of the cumulative damage to Carpenter's aircraft. After particularly intense combat missions, they would count dozens of bullet holes requiring careful patches to maintain the fabric's integrity. The crew chief, whose name has unfortunately been lost to history, reportedly told other pilots that Carpenter's plane looked like Swiss cheese after one especially violent engagement, yet somehow both the pilot and his aircraft continued to return and fly again. The psychological pressure Carpenter endured was immense and unrelenting. Unlike bomber crews who operated at 20,000 feet, relatively removed from the immediate violence of combat below, Carpenter engaged German forces at point-blank range where combat was intensely personal. He could see individual German soldiers firing at him, could see the expressions on tank commanders' faces as they traversed their turrets trying to track his aircraft, could see the muzzle flashes of weapons trying to kill him. The combat was immediate, visceral, and utterly without the emotional distance that altitude might provide. Wes Gallagher, the Associated Press correspondent who interviewed Carpenter multiple times throughout the campaign, wrote in Liberty magazine that the Major was already a legend in an outfit where reckless bravery was considered commonplace. But Gallagher also noted something else in his careful observations, a certain weariness visible in Carpenter's eyes, the unmistakable look of a man who had pushed his luck repeatedly and understood with crystal clarity that the odds were catching up to him. The bazooka installation on Carpenter's L4 underwent constant refinement based on hard-won combat experience. The original mounting system using simple metal brackets proved inadequate under combat stress. The recoil forces generated by firing the rockets would gradually work the brackets loose, creating dangerous instability. The plywood backing plates distributed these forces much more effectively across the wing structure, but added crucial weight to an aircraft already operating at the absolute limits of its design specifications. The electrical firing system presented particularly vexing challenges that required innovative solutions. The wiring had to be carefully routed through the wings and into the cockpit, protected from both weather exposure and enemy fire. Toggle switches were mounted on a simple panel positioned within easy reach of the pilot's right hand, allowing him to maintain aircraft control while firing. Each switch controlled one individual rocket, allowing for precise single shots or devastating volleys of multiple rockets. The entire system had to be reliable enough to function correctly after hours of vibration and extreme maneuvering, yet simple enough that it could be repaired with basic tools available at forward airstrips. Aiming remained entirely visual and intuitive, with no mechanical assistance whatsoever. Carpenter developed his own personal system of reference points, using features like the engine cowling, the cockpit framework, and even scratches on the windscreen as improvised aiming guides. He calculated lead angles mentally based on his approach speed and dive angle, compensating in real time for wind drift and the rocket's ballistic trajectory. There was no backup system, no computer assistance, no second chance. If he missed on the first pass, he had to climb away under withering fire and circle around to try again, giving the Germans more time to prepare their defences. The rockets themselves presented unique challenges that infantry troops never had to consider. The M6A3 heat rounds were designed for ground combat, fired from a soldier's shoulder at relatively stationary targets at close range. When fired from a moving aircraft travelling at high speed, their accuracy decreased dramatically. The rocket motor burned for only 0.3 of a second, reaching maximum velocity almost instantly, but then coasting unpowered to the target. Wind effects, aircraft motion, and the rocket's inherent mechanical inaccuracy meant that even theoretically perfect aim didn't guarantee a successful hit. The Battle of Aracourt, where Carpenter achieved his most famous and documented successes, represented far more than just another tactical engagement in the long campaign across France. It was actually the largest tank battle fought on the entire Western Front, with American forces ultimately destroying 200 German tanks and assault guns while losing only 25 of their own, a remarkable kill ratio. The German operational plan called for the 5th Panzer Army to break through American defensive lines and recapture the city of Nancy, which would threaten the entire flank of Patton's advance toward Germany. The attacking force included some of Germany's best remaining armoured units, though many were significantly under strength and hastily reorganised after the catastrophic defeats suffered in Normandy during the summer. The 4th Armoured Division, Carpenter's assigned unit, bore the primary brunt of the German assault. Significantly outnumbered in terms of raw tank numbers, they relied on superior tactics, much better logistics, and innovative solutions like Carpenter's tank-hunting L4 to offset German advantages. The division's tank destroyers, artillery batteries, and armoured units worked in close coordination, with Carpenter providing absolutely critical reconnaissance information and direct attack capability that other units could not replicate. His actions on September 20th came at an absolutely crucial moment in the battle's development. The German advance had achieved tactical surprise in its initial hours, and some forward American positions were in genuine danger of being overrun and destroyed. By disrupting the Panther Company's attack at a critical juncture, Carpenter bought precious time for American forces to reorganize their defenses and bring up reinforcements from reserve positions. His attack wasn't merely tactically successful in destroying 2 tanks. It had operational implications that affected the entire battle's outcome, disrupting German timing and coordination at a moment when momentum was everything. The psychological impact of Carpenter's unconventional attacks rippled through German ranks far beyond the immediate battlefield. Tank crews who had felt relatively safe from air attack, knowing that American fighter bombers rarely operated effectively in poor weather conditions, now had to fear even the smallest and most innocuous observation aircraft. The constant need to scan the skies for approaching L4s and disperse formations when they appeared overhead significantly slowed German operations and disrupted the careful coordination that armoured warfare demanded. By November of 1944, Carpenter had become something of a celebrity within Patton's Third Army. Stars and Stripes ran multiple feature articles about Bazooka Charlie and his unlikely tank-hunting exploits. Popular Science magazine featured him prominently in their February 1945 issue in a section titled What's New in Aviation, with an article called Piper Cub Tank Buster. Liberty magazine, the New York Sun, and numerous other publications picked up his remarkable story, making him one of the most famous and recognizable pilots in the entire European theatre of operations. But fame and publicity came with a heavy price in increased danger. German units began receiving specific tactical bulletins, warning them explicitly about rocket-armed Cubs and the threat they represented. Anti-aircraft defences were systematically reinforced with additional light guns and machine guns positioned specifically to counter the low-altitude, slow-moving L4 threat. Every mission Carpenter flew became progressively more hazardous as German gunners gained valuable experience in the specific techniques required to engage slow-moving aircraft at extremely low altitude. Carpenter's own comments to reporters and correspondents revealed an increasingly fatalistic attitude about his survival prospects. As he told one journalist, "Some people around here think he was nuts," but he simply believed that if America was going to fight a war, it had to be prosecuted aggressively 60 minutes every hour and 24 hours every day. When another reporter asked him directly about the obvious danger of his missions, he simply shrugged with characteristic nonchalance and said his luck had been marvellous so far. That luck, however improbable, was tested repeatedly in ways that should have been fatal. Beyond the church steeple incident he had mentioned in his letter home to Elder, there were numerous other close calls that could easily have ended his combat career and his life. Machine gun fire once severed one of his elevator control cables, leaving him with only minimal pitch control for the terrifying flight back to friendly territory. On another mission, an anti-aircraft shell exploded close enough to pepper his fragile aircraft with shrapnel fragments, miraculously missing both the pilot and all critical control systems through pure chance. His crew chief, whose identity has unfortunately been lost to historical records, reportedly begged Carpenter repeatedly to stop flying the suicidal rocket attacks. The ground maintenance crews had seen far too many L-4s return to base absolutely riddled with bullet holes, or worse, simply fail to return at all. But Carpenter stubbornly continued his missions, driven by some combination of duty, determination, and perhaps fatalism that his fellow pilots found simultaneously inspiring and deeply concerning. Carpenter's extraordinary courage wasn't limited exclusively to aerial combat operations. On at least one thoroughly documented occasion, he landed his L-4 near an active battlefield, grabbed a discarded M1 Garand rifle, and personally participated in ground combat alongside infantry units. After destroying a German vehicle column with his bazookas from the air, he had landed on a nearby road and took 6 startled German soldiers prisoner single-handedly, marching them back to American lines at gunpoint like a Wild West sheriff. Another remarkable incident involved Carpenter landing his aircraft near a disabled American Sherman tank that was under active German fire. He climbed onto the immobilized tank and manned its .50 caliber machine gun, helping to drive off a determined German infantry assault while the tank crew conducted emergency repairs to get their vehicle mobile again. His actions that day earned him particular recognition and gratitude from the tank crew, who credited him with directly saving their lives when they had been in desperate circumstances. These ground combat episodes earned Carpenter recognition and decorations that extended well beyond his aviation achievements alone. General George Patton himself personally presented Carpenter with the Silver Star, reportedly declaring that Carpenter was exactly the kind of aggressive fighting man he wanted throughout his entire army. Carpenter would also receive the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster and the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, a collection of decorations that testified to sustained exceptional performance under the most hazardous conditions imaginable. The ground combat episodes revealed something fundamentally important about Carpenter's character and psychology. He wasn't content to be merely an observer flying safely above the battlefield, or even just a flying tank destroyer engaging from relative safety. He wanted to be directly in the fight wherever and whenever it was happening, using whatever weapons happened to be available. This attitude, while certainly admirable in terms of courage and commitment, also suggested a man who was pushing himself far beyond any reasonable limits, perhaps seeking something that combat could provide. The official military records credit Carpenter with destroying 6 enemy tanks total, including 2 fearsome Tiger tanks among that number, plus several armoured cars and numerous trucks and light vehicles. Unofficial accounts and anecdotal reports from witnesses, including statements by other pilots and ground forces, suggest the actual number might have been as high as 14 tanks destroyed or disabled by his attacks. The significant discrepancy between official and unofficial tallies likely reflects the inherent difficulty of confirming individual kills in the chaos of fluid combat situations, where multiple different weapons systems frequently engaged the same targets simultaneously. Each confirmed kill that made it into official records required an extraordinary alignment of circumstances. The weather had to be suitable enough for flying operations, yet poor enough that German fighter aircraft weren't active and hunting American planes. Carpenter had to successfully locate worthwhile targets in the vast French countryside. He had to approach close enough to fire without being shot down by the increasingly alert German defences. He had to achieve accurate rocket hits on the vulnerable top armour while under intense fire. And finally, he had to survive the escape climb while every German weapon in range tried to bring him down. The mathematical probability of repeatedly succeeding under these conditions was vanishingly small, yet Carpenter succeeded again and again through some combination of skill, determination, and extraordinary luck. Consider the pure technical challenge of what he was attempting. He was trying to hit a target roughly 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, the approximate dimensions of a tank's vulnerable top surface, while flying at 70 miles per hour in an unstable aircraft from a distance of 100 yards. He was using unguided rockets fired from an improvised platform while under intense enemy fire that was literally tearing holes in his aircraft. Artillery observers who personally witnessed Carpenter's attacks from the ground described them using words like impossible and absolutely insane, unable to believe what they were seeing. The 2 Tiger tanks that Carpenter destroyed represented particularly impressive achievements even among his remarkable record. Each Tiger tank cost Germany 250,000 Reichsmarks to produce, consumed irreplaceable industrial resources, and required specialized crews who had undergone months of intensive training. These vehicles were considered nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons when properly employed. Yet they fell victim to rockets fired from an aircraft that cost the United States Army approximately $2,500 and required only basic pilot training to operate. The economic return on investment was almost absurd when calculated objectively. Carpenter's role in the campaign extended significantly beyond his dramatic tank hunting missions. As an observation pilot and as General Wood's personal aviator, he provided absolutely crucial intelligence information that shaped numerous operational decisions throughout the Lorraine campaign. His ability and willingness to fly low and slow, combined with his characteristically aggressive reconnaissance style, meant he frequently spotted German movements and dispositions before any other intelligence sources could report them. His detailed reports directly influenced several major tactical decisions during the prolonged fighting. When German forces attempted to concentrate armor for major counterattacks, Carpenter's early warnings allowed American commanders to pre-position reserves and coordinate artillery fires to disrupt the attacks before they could develop momentum. His meticulously detailed observations of German defensive positions helped American units plan successful attacks that minimized casualties through better intelligence. The intelligence value of L-4 observation aircraft was already well established throughout the American military, but Carpenter's uniquely aggressive tactics yielded even more valuable information. By forcing German units to react visibly to his presence, shooting at him, dispersing their carefully organized formations, moving vehicles to cover, he inadvertently revealed positions and force strengths that might otherwise have remained concealed from aerial observation. This intelligence work, while considerably less dramatic and publicized than his tank hunting exploits, may actually have been his most valuable overall contribution to the American war effort. The information he provided saved countless American lives and shortened engagements that might otherwise have devolved into prolonged, costly battles of attrition. The remarkable success of Carpenter's improvised weapon system highlighted a curious and revealing aspect of World War II military technology and doctrine. Germany, despite its well-earned reputation for advanced weaponry and engineering excellence, had no equivalent whatsoever to the simple, effective L-4 observation plane that proved so valuable to American forces. The Wehrmacht relied primarily on the Fieseler Storch for similar observation and liaison missions, but it was significantly larger, mechanically more complex, and produced in much smaller numbers due to its complexity. The fundamental American approach of mass-producing simple, reliable equipment that could be easily maintained and repaired with basic tools proved operationally superior to the German emphasis on technological sophistication and engineering perfection. The L-4 was essentially nothing more than a slightly modified civilian aircraft pressed into military service with minimal changes. Yet its very simplicity became its greatest strength in actual combat operations. It was easy to fly, simple to maintain and repair even under primitive field conditions, and could operate from rough forward airstrips that would ground more sophisticated aircraft. Germany's tank designers had created truly magnificent machines that were brilliantly optimized for tank versus tank combat at long ranges. The Panther's powerful long 75mm gun could destroy virtually any Allied tank at ranges where effective return fire was impossible. Its carefully sloped frontal armor was nearly impervious to Allied anti-tank weapons when engaged head-on. But this ruthless optimization for direct ground combat had created vulnerabilities in other areas that simple American ingenuity could identify and exploit with devastating effectiveness. The bazooka itself represented quintessential American military pragmatism at its finest. Developed rapidly from a simple concept, mass-produced in enormous numbers, it gave every infantry squad genuine anti-tank capability that had previously required specialized weapons and extensive training. When Carpenter boldly mounted 6 of them on a civilian observation plane, he created an entirely new weapons system that German military doctrine had never anticipated and simply couldn't effectively counter with existing defensive measures. As 1944 turned into 1945, Carpenter doggedly continued flying increasingly dangerous combat missions, despite the growing German awareness of rocket-armed observation aircraft and the defensive measures being implemented. The Wehrmacht issued increasingly urgent specific instructions for dealing with armed observation aircraft, including dedicated orders to track them constantly and engage them aggressively with all available weapons whenever they appeared. In December of 1944, during the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge when Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, Carpenter flew crucial reconnaissance missions in absolutely terrible weather conditions that kept most other aircraft firmly grounded. His detailed reports on German troop movements and concentrations helped American commanders respond effectively to the surprise offensive. Though the poor weather and low clouds gave him fewer opportunities for his characteristic tank hunting attacks, his intelligence gathering during this critical period proved absolutely invaluable to the American response. January 1945 brought renewed American offensive operations as Allied forces methodically pushed toward the Rhine River and the German frontier. Carpenter continued his pattern of constantly modifying and refining his tactics, experimenting persistently with different attack angles and various rocket-firing combinations to improve his effectiveness. He reportedly seriously considered adding even more rockets to his aircraft to increase firepower, but was ultimately constrained by the L-4's strict weight capacity limitations and the structural limits of the wing struts that simply couldn't bear any additional load safely. His last confirmed tank kill of the war came in February 1945, when he successfully destroyed a Panzer Mark IV that was attempting to defend a strategically important bridge crossing. Multiple witnesses described him diving almost vertically through an absolutely solid wall of tracer fire to deliver his rockets at point-blank range, where accuracy was highest. The tank's destruction allowed American combat engineers to capture the bridge completely intact, significantly accelerating the American advance deeper into Germany by avoiding a time-consuming river crossing operation. In March of 1945, Carpenter began experiencing increasingly severe fatigue and other troubling symptoms that ultimately forced him to accept medical evaluation. Doctors diagnosed him with Hodgkin's disease, a form of lymphatic cancer that was invariably fatal with the medical knowledge and treatments available in 1945. He was given approximately 2 years to live at most and was immediately grounded from all combat flying operations. The timing of his diagnosis was perhaps grimly fortunate in retrospect. As German forces became increasingly desperate in the war's final chaotic months, anti-aircraft defences paradoxically became more deadly and effective, even as Germany's overall military situation deteriorated. Several other L-4 pilots who attempted to emulate Carpenter's aggressive tank hunting tactics were shot down and killed during March and April of 1945. The narrow window of opportunity for his unique and unprecedented form of aerial warfare was rapidly closing as German defences adapted. Carpenter received an honorable discharge from the United States Army in 1946 and returned home to resume his interrupted life as a civilian and educator. Against all medical predictions and expectations, he survived far longer than the 2 years his doctors had initially given him to live. He resumed teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois, rebuilt his marriage and family life with Elda, and watched his daughter Carol grow up. Remarkably, he very rarely spoke about his extraordinary wartime experiences to anyone. His daughter later revealed in interviews that she knew virtually nothing about her father's combat record and decorations until after his death. This silence about combat experiences was certainly common among veterans of that generation, but it seemed particularly poignant given the absolutely extraordinary nature of Carpenter's specific service and achievements. During summer months when school was not in session, Carpenter operated a boys' summer camp in the Ozark Mountains, teaching outdoor skills, self-reliance, and character development to young men. Former campers who were interviewed many decades later remembered him consistently as strict but fundamentally fair in his dealings, demanding high standards but genuinely supportive of those who made honest efforts. None of these boys had any idea they were being taught and mentored by one of the war's most highly decorated and unlikely tank hunters. His health gradually but inexorably deteriorated through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The Hodgkin's disease that should have killed him by 1947 instead became a chronic condition that he battled courageously for nearly 20 years. He continued teaching in the classroom until shortly before his death on March 22, 1966, at age 53, having far exceeded his original prognosis through sheer determination. For many decades following the war, the ultimate fate of Rosie the Rocketer herself remained completely unknown to historians and aviation enthusiasts. The aircraft had presumably been scrapped along with thousands of other surplus L-4s after the war ended, its unique historical significance simply unrecognized by whoever processed it for disposal. Then, in October of 2017, aviation historians made an absolutely remarkable and unexpected discovery. Serial number 43-30426 was found in the collection of the Austrian Aviation Museum in Bad Wörslau, Austria. Exactly how Carpenter's specific aircraft had made its way to an Austrian museum remained unclear and somewhat mysterious, but the serial numbers and other identifying markings definitively confirmed its identity as Carpenter's Rosie the Rocketer. Even more remarkably, careful examination revealed that the aircraft still retained clear physical evidence of its extensive combat service, including dozens of carefully and professionally patched bullet holes throughout the fabric covering. The mounting points where the 6 bazookas had been attached were still clearly visible on the wing struts, silent testimony to the aircraft's unique and deadly modification. Detailed technical analysis of the recovered aircraft revealed just how remarkably fortunate Carpenter had been throughout his combat missions. Several bullet holes had passed within inches of critical control cables that, if severed, would have rendered the aircraft completely uncontrollable and resulted in an immediate fatal crash. Other damage showed just how close German gunners had come to striking the pilot himself or rupturing the unprotected fuel tank that would have created an instant inferno. The aircraft was eventually repatriated to the United States and underwent an extensive, meticulous restoration by skilled craftsmen and aviation historians. The restoration team made the careful decision to preserve the combat damage and battle scars rather than restore the aircraft to pristine, factory-new condition. Those bullet holes and patches represented irreplaceable historical evidence of what the aircraft and its pilot had endured. Today, the fully restored Rosie the Rocketer is proudly displayed at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, where visitors can see firsthand the fragile aircraft that hunted German heavy tanks across France. The museum has created an extensive, comprehensive exhibit surrounding the aircraft that tells Charles Carpenter's complete story through photographs, letters, official documents, and detailed explanatory panels. Standing next to the actual aircraft, examining its delicate construction and the visible combat damage it sustained, visitors invariably express amazement that anyone could have survived flying such missions, let alone succeeded repeatedly. Carpenter's tactical innovations and aggressive spirit influenced military thinking about close air support in ways that extended far beyond World War II. The Korean War saw some limited experimental attempts with armed light aircraft, though none achieved anything approaching Carpenter's level of success or impact. The real practical vindication of his fundamental concept came with the development and deployment of dedicated attack helicopters beginning in the 1960s. The AH-1 Cobra and later the AH-64 Apache helicopters embodied precisely the same operational principle that Carpenter had demonstrated: that slow, low-altitude platforms capable of extended loitering could deliver devastatingly precise direct-fire support to ground forces more effectively than high-speed jet aircraft making brief attack runs. Modern military doctrine explicitly recognizes the value of what Carpenter conclusively demonstrated through his actions, that effective air support doesn't always require supersonic jets dropping massive bombs. Sometimes, precise firepower delivered at close range by a platform that can hover, observe, and engage targets methodically is far more valuable than high-speed attack runs that are over in seconds. The fundamentally improvised nature of Carpenter's entire weapon system also significantly influenced military institutional thinking about field modifications and soldier-driven innovation. The United States military became considerably more receptive to bottom-up improvements and suggestions from combat troops, recognizing that soldiers facing problems directly often developed practical, effective solutions that rear-echelon engineers and planners had never anticipated or considered. In 2023, Carpenter's daughter Carol Apache collaborated with respected aviation writer James Bashaw to co-author Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. The comprehensive book, based on hundreds of carefully preserved letters, photographs, and official documents, revealed intimate details about the complex man behind the growing legend. The personal letters showed a multifaceted individual who was genuinely brave but not reckless, characteristically aggressive but also thoughtful and introspective. His private writing revealed someone who clearly understood the profound moral complexities of warfare while maintaining absolute determination to fulfill his duty. He expressed understandable pride in his tactical achievements and the lives he had saved, but also deep sadness at the brutal necessity of killing other human beings. One particularly moving and poignant letter, written shortly after he had destroyed a Tiger tank and presumably killed its crew, reflected seriously on the fundamental humanity of his enemies. They were someone's beloved sons, he wrote, perhaps fathers themselves with families waiting at home. But they were actively trying to kill his friends and fellow soldiers, and he simply couldn't allow that to happen. This kind of emotional intelligence and moral awareness, combined with his undeniable tactical brilliance and physical courage, made Carpenter truly exceptional among warriors. Carol Apache has described her father in numerous interviews as fundamentally a peaceful man who had successfully compartmentalized his traumatic war experiences in order to function afterward. He had deliberately moved on emotionally, she explained, from what he had experienced and done during the war. She acknowledged that she believed he came home from Europe emotionally shattered in ways that took years to heal, and that it was an extremely difficult time for her mother Elder as well, who had waited 4 long years for him to return home, often thinking he never would. A beautiful bronze sculpture unveiled at Moline High School in 2023 commemorates Carpenter's service and sacrifice, depicting him standing beside a detailed representation of his modified L-4. The sculpture dedication ceremony drew military veterans, aviation historians, and enthusiasts from across the entire country. Elderly former students from his years of teaching, now in their 80s and 90s, shared warm memories of a dedicated, demanding educator who had never once mentioned his extraordinary wartime heroics to his students. The American Heritage Museum, where the restored Rosie the Rocketer is permanently displayed, has created an extensive educational exhibit specifically about Carpenter's remarkable service. Museum visitors can see and examine the actual historical aircraft, complete with its carefully preserved bullet holes and combat damage, and learn comprehensively about the unlikely man who transformed a defenseless observation plane into a feared tank destroyer through pure innovation and courage. The Experimental Aircraft Association regularly features Carpenter's inspiring story in educational programs nationwide, using his unprecedented innovation as a powerful example of American ingenuity, determination, and the ability to turn apparent limitations into decisive advantages. Young pilots learning their craft study not just his specific tactical achievements, but the fundamental type of creative thinking that consistently turns obstacles and limitations into opportunities. Military historians and tactical analysts continue to study Carpenter's methods and their documented impact on the broader Lorraine campaign. While his 6 officially confirmed tank kills might seem relatively modest when compared to the many thousands of tanks destroyed throughout World War II, the psychological impact and tactical disruption he caused far exceeded the simple numerical count of destroyed vehicles. Carpenter's unprecedented success raises profound and interesting questions about innovation, courage, and the fundamental nature of warfare itself. How did an ordinary high school history teacher with no special combat training or background become one of the war's most unusual and unlikely aces? The answer lies in a rare combination of factors and circumstances that very rarely align so perfectly. First, and perhaps most importantly, his unique position as General Wood's trusted personal pilot gave him unusual operational freedom to pursue his own tactical initiatives and innovations. Most L4 pilots were strictly restricted to specific assigned reconnaissance patterns and rigid schedules dictated by higher headquarters. Carpenter enjoyed the freedom to hunt targets of opportunity independently, choosing when, where, and how to strike based on his own tactical judgment. Second, his professional background as a history teacher may have contributed significantly to his tactical thinking and situational awareness. Good history teachers inherently understand patterns, cause and effect relationships, and the critical importance of timing in human affairs. Carpenter systematically applied these analytical skills directly to combat operations, recognizing vulnerabilities and opportunities that others might easily have missed. Third, the specific conditions of the Lorraine campaign created unique opportunities for his unconventional tactics to succeed. The relatively open terrain, the high concentration of German armoured forces, and the fluid, mobile nature of the battle meant that worthwhile targets were consistently available if someone possessed the courage to engage them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Carpenter possessed an extremely rare combination of personal courage and philosophical fatalism that allowed him to repeatedly risk absolutely everything. His famous comment about attacking 60 minutes every hour and 24 hours every day revealed someone who had fundamentally accepted the strong likelihood of death and had consciously decided to make his life count for something meaningful before the inevitable occurred. The stark statistics of Carpenter's combat service, when examined carefully and objectively, reveal the truly extraordinary nature of his achievement. 6 enemy tanks officially confirmed destroyed, including 2 Tiger heavy tanks. Multiple armoured vehicles, trucks and other targets destroyed beyond the confirmed tank kills. 16 rockets fired across just 3 sorties on the single day of September 20th, 1944. Approximately 100 total combat missions flown under increasingly dangerous conditions. 0 L4 Grasshopper aircraft lost despite suffering multiple direct hits from enemy fire. 1 pilot who survived what should have been mathematically impossible odds. Each of these simple numbers represents dozens or hundreds of split-second decisions under extreme stress, any single one of which could easily have proven fatal. The fact that Carpenter survived his entire combat tour defied every reasonable probability calculation. Contemporary pilots who attempted to emulate his aggressive tactics rarely survived more than a handful of missions before being shot down. The economic equation was equally remarkable when calculated objectively. The total cost of Carpenter's L4 aircraft and all modifications was certainly less than $5,000. The Tiger tanks he personally destroyed cost Germany over 250,000 Reichsmarks each to design, produce and field, not even counting the extensive costs of training specialized crews and transporting the massive vehicles to the battlefield. In purely financial and industrial terms, Carpenter achieved one of the highest return on investment ratios of the entire war. Despite extensive documentation in official records and numerous contemporary accounts, some aspects of Carpenter's story and psychology remain fundamentally mysterious and unexplained. How exactly did he maintain the psychological stability and emotional equilibrium necessary to continue such extraordinarily dangerous missions day after day? What ultimately drove him to push far beyond the already dangerous requirements of observation, flying into the realm of direct tank hunting combat. His surviving letters provide some intriguing clues, but no completely satisfying answers. He wrote eloquently about duty and obligation, about protecting fellow American soldiers, about desperately wanting the war to end so he could return home to his family. But these entirely understandable motivations, while certainly admirable, don't fully explain the exceptional risks he voluntarily and repeatedly took. Perhaps the answer lies partly in his generational context and the times that shaped him. The men who fought World War II had survived the grinding poverty and desperation of the Great Depression, intimately understanding hardship, sacrifice, and the need to persevere against overwhelming odds. They had witnessed firsthand the rise of fascism and militarism in Europe and understood it clearly as an existential threat to democracy and human freedom. For someone like Carpenter, who had taught history professionally and understood the profound stakes involved, half measures and safe choices were simply unacceptable responses to the crisis. Or perhaps the explanation is actually simpler and more straightforward than complex psychological analysis might suggest. In the crucible of war, ordinary people sometimes accomplish extraordinary things simply because circumstances absolutely demand it. Carpenter identified a critical problem, German armored forces threatening American troops, and developed an innovative solution using available resources, however improbable that solution might appear to conventional military thinking. That his practical solution required flying a defenseless fabric-covered plane directly into point-blank range of enemy guns was simply an acceptable risk in service of a greater purpose. Carpenter's tactical innovations influenced far more than just immediate military tactics and procedures. His story became an important part of the broader American mythology of ingenuity and individual initiative, the deeply held cultural belief that a clever individual with basic tools and determination could overcome sophisticated enemy technology through creative thinking. This narrative resonated particularly strongly in post-war America as the nation collectively sought to understand and explain its hard-won victory over enemies that had initially seemed so formidable and technologically advanced. Carpenter's classic David versus Goliath story provided a perfect metaphor and example, representing American practicality and individual initiative triumphing decisively over German engineering excellence and rigid military tradition. The story also significantly influenced how the American military establishment thought about innovation and unconventional solutions. Rather than automatically dismissing unconventional ideas proposed by junior officers or enlisted personnel, commanders gradually became more genuinely open to field expedients and soldier-driven improvements that came from the bottom up. The fundamental lesson of Bazooka Charlie was crystal clear. Sometimes the very best solutions to tactical problems come from those closest to the problem who experience it directly. For the broader aviation community, Carpenter's remarkable exploits convincingly demonstrated the surprising versatility and utility of simple light aircraft. The humble Piper Cub, originally designed solely as a basic trainer and recreational pleasure aircraft, had proven itself capable of performing roles its designers had never remotely imagined. This demonstrated versatility would significantly influence post-war aircraft development, with designers increasingly considering multiple potential uses for their creations, rather than narrow specialization. The extraordinary story of Charles Bazooka. Charlie Carpenter fundamentally defies conventional military narrative and doctrine. A small-town history teacher flying a completely unarmed observation plane logically should not have been able to destroy sophisticated German heavy tanks under any circumstances. A fragile fabric-covered aircraft with a tiny 65-horsepower engine should not have survived repeated combat missions against concentrated ground fire. 6 infantry bazookas crudely strapped to flimsy wing struts should not have constituted an effective anti-tank weapons system by any rational analysis. Yet all of these seemingly impossible things actually happened. Between September 1944 and February 1945, Carpenter successfully transformed the humble L-4 Grasshopper from a purely passive observation platform into an effective active combat system feared by German forces. His official documented tally of 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 powerful Tiger tanks, stands as one of the most improbable achievements in the entire history of military aviation. The German forces fighting at Aracourt and throughout the difficult Lorraine campaign learned painfully to fear the distinctive sound of small aircraft engines overhead. What had previously been harmless reconnaissance spotters suddenly became harbingers of potential death from above. Tank crews who had felt relatively safe from American fighter bombers, which rarely operated effectively in poor weather conditions or at very low altitudes, now faced an unexpected threat they simply couldn't effectively counter with existing doctrine and equipment. The transformation in German anti-aircraft tactics, from routinely ignoring L-4s to engaging them aggressively with every available weapon, demonstrates clearly the strategic impact of one pilot's innovation. Carpenter forced the Wehrmacht to fundamentally adapt its air defense doctrine, disperse its carefully organized armored formations, and constantly monitor the skies for slow-moving threats. These necessary adjustments disrupted German operations at all levels and contributed measurably to American tactical success throughout the Lorraine campaign. More than simple military achievement, Carpenter's story represents the ultimate triumph of ingenuity and creative thinking over rigid conventional wisdom. Faced with the pressing problem of German armored superiority, he created an unprecedented solution using readily available materials and sheer determination. The bazookas were designed for infantry ground combat. The L-4 was designed for observation and liaison duties. Combined by someone willing to risk everything, they became something neither military designers nor operational planners had ever imagined possible. The restored Rosie the Rocketer, now displayed permanently with its historic battle damage carefully preserved, stands as a powerful testament to American innovation and individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Each carefully patched bullet hole represents a specific moment when probability strongly suggested failure and death, yet Carpenter pressed his attack anyway. The fragile aircraft that should logically have been destroyed multiple times instead survived to tell its remarkable story to future generations. Charles Carpenter died in 1966, having outlived his grim medical prognosis by 19 years through sheer willpower and determination. He spent those precious additional years teaching young Americans about history and citizenship, perhaps hoping they would understand that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when circumstances and necessity demand it. His former students remembered him consistently as demanding but fair, never knowing they were being taught by someone who had fundamentally changed the nature of aerial warfare through innovation. The German tank crews who faced him across the French countryside would have been absolutely stunned to learn their feared nemesis was simply a high school history teacher. They would have been equally amazed to discover that the sophisticated weapon system terrorizing them was nothing more than 6 standard infantry bazookas strapped to a basic civilian aircraft. But perhaps they would have understood the larger, more important truth about warfare and human conflict. Innovation, courage, and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds and defeat much more powerful opponents. The humble L-4 Grasshopper that successfully hunted mighty panthers and tigers across war-torn France proved conclusively that David could still defeat Goliath in modern warfare, especially when David possessed 6 rocket launchers and the extraordinary courage to use them at point-blank range despite overwhelming danger. In the end, that may be the most important and enduring lesson from Bazooka Charlie's war, that human ingenuity, creativity, and raw courage can transform even the most humble and unlikely tools into weapons of decisive victory.